ever wondered why the fashionable elite or old money aesthetic went from the bold, huge dresses with tons of fabric and beautiful colors to the sad beige people? Well, I'm here to tell you. Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from So Third Time, and this time we're taking a look at how old money fashion and aesthetic has changed throughout history and why it led to the sad beige people fashion that we currently have. Well, there has always been many different driving forces behind fashion trends, including social, financial, and political ones. One big thing that has been the driving force behind fashion trends has always been the rich elites' desire to separate themselves from the rest of us by the way they dress. We're going to be looking at this through a Eurocentric lens because that's where my expertise is. But of course, there is the same sort of desire to separate yourself from the masses in other cultures too, and they manifest in different ways, especially up until the Victorian era. During the Victorian era, and especially heading into the 20th century, fashion becomes a global phenomenon, and European fashion kind of takes over most of other cultural fashion. But looking at Eurocentric fashion throughout time, for most of the time, it was very easy for the elite to separate themselves from the common people simply because they could afford a lot better cloth and a lot better, just the fibers and the quality of the cloth and the fabrics and just everything was better. And this was easily visible. It was something that you could easily tell, especially because upper classes would wear a lot of much finer quality wool and then of course silk, which of course coming from Asia would have always been expensive, even if it was of lower quality, so-called. It still would have been expensive simply because of how far it traveled. Because regardless of what fiber the fabric was made out of, fabric was in itself very expensive for most of history, especially pre-industrial revolution, simply because it was very labor intensive to get to the actual fabric. If it isn't, because obviously they had only natural fibers, but if the natural fiber was plant-based, like cotton or linen or some other, like nettle, there was hemp and this kind of ramie, all kinds of like plant-based fibers, they had to be first treated before you could get to the actual fiber that could then be made into thread and yarn. And then when you finally got to that thread, be it from an animal as a silk cocoon or just shearing a sheep or what other wool producing animal you used, or then those plant-based fibers, when you finally got to that thread phase, you still had to ply it multiple times usually to get it thick enough to be able to be woven into cloth. And then you needed to weave the cloth. And no, most people throughout most of history would not make most fabrics themselves. They would definitely be a highly specialized skill that only some people would have. And on top of that, looms, the things where you make the cloth, those are expensive. So not everybody would be able to afford one anyways. So most people had to buy most of their fabric. And when you bought fabric, it was expensive. It was expensive enough that even the elite would reuse and recycle their fabrics and clothing and remake them and patch them and try to get as much use out of them. There are even like elite queens wardrobes where there are clothing where it is patched, it's mended, it is taken care of, and it is worn to the absolute last bits of it. Simply because that's how expensive fabric was. And then, of course, during the medieval times, when there starts to be a bigger and bigger merchant class and people start accumulating some wealth, there also comes into play sumptuary laws. These are laws designed to keep the regular folks from dressing in elite clothing. Oftentimes, especially things like silk were regulated, and even some sort of fabric dyes. The most expensive fabric dyes were often reserved for only the richest elite, oftentimes royalty. And though silk of itself is a very expensive fiber, for the richest elite, the very old money people, usually, again, royal people, there was an option called cloth of silver or cloth of gold. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's literal silk fabric with gold or silver woven into it. Of course, this was extremely expensive and also slightly impractical. Like, I would not want to go around like working in a field in a cloth of gold dress. I do not think that would be comfortable in any shape or form. And this generally was enough to separate yourself as the rich elite from the regular folks throughout the medieval times. Then as we head into the Renaissance, people again have gained more wealth, and the merchant class again has gained more influence and wealth, but still the rich elite, the titled people, want to separate themselves from them. Like, it's not enough ever to be like regular rich. No, the elite want to be clearly separated even from the regular rich. So what they do is they come up with fashions that you simply cannot wear if you are working. Big sleeves with a bunch of fur on them, really huge hangy bits that simply would keep your hands from being able to do any sort of real labor. Dresses become so big, and they have different sorts of farthingales. That is a dress support, kind of like a hoop skirt, that literally there's hoops that keep you from getting too close to things so that simply you cannot work in these things. And that's why that elite upper class is often referred to as the leisure class, because they emulated with their fashion that, oh, I don't need to work, I don't need to do even domestic labor, I'm above all of that. All I need to do as a rich lady is some needlework where I can do it daintily sitting in my chair, and I don't have to actually have huge arm movement or anything like that. I can just do it little dainty stuff. And there was a different version of this kind of fashion for men. There were huge sleeves also for men. And then the ginormous cod pieces during Henry VIII's reign, yeah. They could get so big that you literally can't sit very close to a table. So, obviously, any sort of labor-intensive work would not be an option in that sort of clothing. And this as a solution worked for a very long time, and they used this pretty much up until the 18th century. Of course, fashion changed, the shapes changed, and the actual different techniques of how to make clothing changed a lot during this time. But the basic idea is to separate yourself from the regular folks is by wearing clothing that would be impractical for regular work. Be it because of the sheer amount of fabric, or because of where the fabric is placed, be it on a huge sleeve, be it so wide of a neckline that seriously your arms can't have the full range of movement, or whatever. But that was basically the idea. But as we get into the 18th century, people run into a new problem, because there is not only just the merchant class that is getting richer and richer, but there's also a huge surgence of money to the middle class. The people who are not the rich merchants, but the regular people, they also start accumulating wealth. And because, like I said, fiber and fabric is expensive, people do not throw something away. So there's a huge secondhand market of clothing too. And by this time, also because technology has gotten forward and simply things have gotten cheaper, fabric isn't quite as expensive as it used to be, even though it still definitely is expensive. More and more people are able to afford things like silk. And so there starts to be a lot of complaints that you have a hard time telling a servant from a lady, because simply they can afford the same stuff. And also because the rich elites started using fashion as a way to boost their social standing, not only for themselves, but also for their household. So a lot of times ladies would be actually dressing, especially their ladies' maid, but other maids too, in their old clothing. So it wasn't necessarily so worn out that you could clearly tell, oh, she isn't rich. But instead, it led to awkward situations where a gentleman coming into a house wouldn't necessarily know who's the lady of the house and who's the maid. Or walking down the street, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell anymore who is the fashionable elite. And this, of course, does not work for the fashionable elite or the upper class, that very tiny 1% of the 1%. They want to show their wealth and be clearly separated from the rest of us. So one way to combat this was that they started importing a lot more cotton, and especially cotton muslins, really thin cottons, fabrics that are sheer, very delicate, things that aren't easy to keep clean, and that are just simply too sheer and thin to be very rugged. So that again starts showing as a way of showing your wealth, that hey, I can afford to dress in this clothing that simply could not take the wear and tear of actual physical labor. And on top of this, gowns also start becoming trained, so that you have these huge trains on clothing, so that clearly if you're working, you can't just walk around with this huge train. And that's kind of where we get this idea that you're not allowed to show your ankles in history, because it's definitely not a thing in the 18th century. Even upper class elite women would be showing their ankles several times throughout the 18th century. But by the time we get into the 19th century, the elite classes, the upper classes, they were wearing all these very long flowy gowns simply because silk was starting to be more common and had been for a while. So it was harder and harder to find a silk that would clearly tell everyone that no lower class or regular person could afford this, that this is clearly an elite 1%er. So instead, they started wearing these really flowy gowns that simply, and oftentimes they were white, again for the same reason, because yeah, you might be able to wear a white undershirt that you can boil and wash with really harsh methods like boiling it in lye and really just harsh treatments to it. You can't do that if the fabric is very sheer and delicate. You need to be more gentle with it. And then if it's getting muddy and dirty, of course, not only will it not look nice, but also it will get to the point very fast where you simply cannot clean it anymore. So again, this is a thing that the elite does because the regular folks can't emulate this. They can wear the long flowy gowns, but they can't have them with a huge train, and they can't have them quite as sheer and as white because they're not going to stay that way, especially if they're long and flowy and have a huge train on them. It just doesn't work. And then of course fashion changes yet again. And then the next thing that we get is this really wide neckline and then with ginormous sleeves. The Gigot sleeves of the 1830s, they can easily be a meter of fabric in just that one sleeve, or a yard of fabric. So clearly that is not something you can work with. And especially because they have supports in there to keep it up, like you're essentially wearing a pillow on your arm. So you have a wide neckline, you're wearing pillows on your arms, and then you have a meter of fabric there right next to your face. That's clearly not something you can work in. This is not something that I can go and do, heavy lifting in. So clearly, again, a fashion style that was the rich elite's way of making sure that the regular folk did not follow, because they couldn't. And the same becomes true of the crinoline era, and before the actual hoop skirt crinoline, they're just layering petticoats upon petticoats upon petticoats. And like, if you're wearing like 7 petticoats on top of each other, you're not going to be able to work much because you're going to get hot and sweaty no matter like how breathable your fabrics are. If you're doing physical labor, you're going to get hot and sweaty. So again, not an option. And also like the sheer amount of cloth, because the thing is that during the Victorian era, because of the Industrial Revolution, fabric was getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So it was less and less a way to show wealth by, oh, look how much fabric this requires. It could be, but also regular folks could emulate that. They could buy the fabric. And also because fabric was starting to be made with machinery, the quality and the discernible quality wasn't so clear. You couldn't immediately tell by looking at the cloth that, oh, this is lower quality than this. You might be able to tell it like after a year of wear that this clearly did not wear as well as this one. This clearly shows a lot more pilling and just signs of wear and tear than this one. But that's not something that you can immediately discern by just looking at the person in, their clothing. That's something you can tell when you buy the cloth and wear the cloth. But that's not obvious to an outsider. And this sort of like making sure that your clothing is simply of a style that regular folks can't wear becomes the most apparent when we get into that really big crinoline era with the ginormous hoop skirts, because the biggest ones, most fashionable ones that elite wear, simply if you have a house with, regular sized doorways, you can't fit through them. Yes, you can squeeze through them. That's like, they do bend over and they move with you. That's not a problem. But like, you don't want to be squeezing through doors if you have something in your hands and you're like actually doing things. So again, it was so impractical that regular folk just couldn't wear it. And that's not to say that regular folk weren't wearing fashionable clothing. It's just that they never could achieve these extremes that fashion dictated, these extremely trendy things, these that instantly the elite people could discern their own people by just looking at a crowd. Because regular folks just couldn't do it because it would be too impractical, it would be too difficult, and it would be a huge waste of time and money and resources. And that's also why embroidery becomes hugely fashionable around the same time. Because when the sewing machine makes the actual sewing of the garment so much faster, that's not really a way to efficiently show that you are rich enough. So a lot of those hand-finished things, a lot of that would show that clearly you have the time or the money or the resources to get that on your fabric. Just regular women wouldn't be able to have a full dress full of hand embroidery. That would take too much of their time, and the dress probably wouldn't be fashionable by the time she got it done. And the same is true for beadwork and all sorts of fancy embellishments that really explode in the late Victorian and early 20th century, because simply, yet again, it is a way to show I am clearly rich enough and of the leisure class that I can afford this, I can do this. And also, around the same time, it happens the dawn of the washing machine. They're mechanical at first, but clearly that makes laundering a lot easier and faster. But if a dress has a whole bunch of embellishments of different sort of materials, it clearly cannot be washed with water. So cleaning it would be a lot of meticulous hard work that, a regular woman who had to do maybe her own laundry or had to pay somebody who didn't have somebody on staff all the time just to do laundry, that would be such a huge chunk and thing for her to pay that it clearly wouldn't be very practical. Whereas if you're rich enough, if you have people on staff that are just there to clean your garments, it's not a problem. Why would it matter? So in this post-industrial era world, it simply didn't make sense to try to separate yourself from the regular folks by having a huge amount of fabric and huge dresses, because that simply wasn't cutting it anymore. Fabric was so much cheaper, the actual sewing of the garment was so much faster, that it simply just didn't make sense anymore. And that's why we get in the 20th century just mostly much smaller clothing than in the past. So as the 20th century progresses and ready-made or fast fashion clothing becomes the standard, the way to separate yourself from the masses becomes tailoring. When most garments are being purchased in standard sizing, it's not going to fit everyone correctly. Well, it won't fit most people correctly, because if you come up with a standard body, if it's an average of everyone, rarely anybody is actually average, but most people will be something a little bit off from it. So things are not going to fit right. So if you can afford to have your clothing tailored, and especially like not just sewn by somebody for you or altered to your body, but actually tailored from the beginning, that is going to clearly show in the garments. And that is going to be a clear indication that now I am elite. And of course, a huge part of this is that we're going to have to start to see also a simple decline in sewing skills. Because if everybody can sew and they can alter their clothing, then it will be harder to discern whether somebody is just sewing it at home or altering it at home to fit their body, or if it's actually tailored by somebody else to fit their body. So what starts happening is that sewing skills are taught less and less to people, and on top of that, we start seeing also fashion cycles go faster and faster and faster, and the quality of the clothing being produced lowering, and the actual garments, they're made as cheaply as possible, so that they're not any more of the quality standard than they were some 20, 50, 100 years ago. So even the ready-made clothing as just clothing isn't as good as it used to be. So again, yet that widens the gap between the average consumer and the clothing they can actually get their hands on, and the rich elite. And because of synthetic dyes, we don't have to worry about not laundering clothing anymore, because they are fairly color fast. They don't wash off. So that's not really anymore a thing where you can show, oh, I'm so rich because I can have bright colors. Everybody can have bright colors. So instead, the elite fashion goes in the exact opposite direction, because laundering is easy, but our laundry methods are not actually as good as they were in the past. As good at actually getting things clean. So because the clothing is poor quality, it can't anymore handle the harsh cleaning methods of the past to get things to stay white or light colors. So that leads to the fashionable elite dressing in a lot of light colors that simply, if you work, especially if you do physical work, but just if you can't afford to buy a whole bunch of clothing, you simply can't afford to be all the time wearing light colored pants, because they're going to get dirty and they're going to get stained permanently, and they're just going to get, grayed and washed, and they're not going to look nice the same way as a darker pair of pants. And because of fast fashion, and because fast fashion is just less and less good quality to begin with, so that we can't be wearing our clothes that long, that also leads into everyone following a fairly fast fashion cycle. If you can't wear a shirt for more than a year, clearly you're going to have to buy a new one. So if the style has changed, you're going to buy that new style. So this also leads to the fact that fashion for the actual elite, the old money fashion, actually becomes less trend-centered. Because the trendiest people they might have more money than the average person who can't afford to buy a whole heap of clothing, but they can afford, they still buy generally the more cheaper stuff because they can't afford hundreds upon hundreds to follow every micro trend of the actual expensive stuff. So then it becomes kind of a trend among the most elite people and the old money crowd to not follow the micro trends. But don't get me wrong, that does by no means mean that the very elite would somehow be more sustainable than the rest of us. No, it's just that their unsustainability shows up in different ways, and that micro trend following isn't really the thing, and that's why it's not a part of the old money aesthetics. Because again, there is so many people nowadays who are like, yes, I understand it feels like we have less and less money as a society, but there still is so many regular rich people that, and because like the rich people most of us know or have met are not actually a part of the elite. They are still very far away from that very, very elite old money crowd. And that is a very separate thing, because there are so many more millionaires nowadays. Yes, the general population actually, and the wage gap between, the regular folk and the richest of rich is actually bigger now than it was during the French Revolution, or leading up to the French Revolution, which is kind of insane if you think of it. But there still is so many more of that regular rich crowd than there used to be in the past, up until really the Victorian era. So that is why, and because there has been this wealth since the Victorian era, there is this huge need to differentiate yourself as not a regular rich person, but really that old money. And that is why there's such a huge difference in the styles. And that's also why we get the so boring minimalistic home and interior design. Because again, that's unfortunately because of fast fashion and industrialization. It's just the easiest way to separate yourself from the regular folks. Because if you're poor, you can't afford to be minimalistic, because you have to buy the things that you will need now and that you might need, a year from now again, and not in between, because you can't just go and buy a new thing all the time. Whereas, if you're rich enough, you can buy the new thing, use it, and then if you don't use it all the time, then just throw it out, and if you need it in a year to 5, you can just go and buy a new thing. So unfortunately, I believe that we're kind of stuck with this sad beige people fashion as the old money aesthetic, up until the point where enough of the regular rich folk start to emulate that again there becomes a need to change that trend. Or then maybe hopefully just something else happens in the political or social aspect that causes that change. Because I want to get the, Baroque or Rococo castles again. I much rather see that sort of if you're rich, if you're stupid rich, not like regular rich, stupid rich, I want to see you do this silly, ridiculous, huge castle with all the things and the turrets and all the things. I'd much rather see you do that than do the sad minimalistic beige thing and use your money on that. Be more creative with your money if you have that kind of money. Well, I think that's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please hit that like button and share and do all the things, because it really does help out in this world. And bye!